Thank you all for coming out. This is my first reading from the book, which officially comes out tomorrow, but we're getting to release it today, which is fantastic, so thank you. It's going to be my first attempt at reading, lecturing about it, so bear with me. I haven't even figured out exactly how long this is going to work, but I'll try to make it about 20 minutes. So it starts with thinking about the fact that I learned about a lot of things in medical school, but mortality really wasn't one of them. I had a cadaver I was given to dissect, and yet our textbooks had almost nothing about aging or frailty or dying. The task we had in medical school was really to learn how to save lives. We weren't trying to figure out or learn how to tend to the demise of people's lives. So I had never seen anybody die before I became a doctor. When I did, it was something of a shock. I'd had many family members who had suffered through serious illness. I'd written about some of them in my previous books. Two of my kids had gone through serious life-threatening problems. And virtually every time medicine pulled them through. I knew theoretically that my patients could die, of course, but whenever it happened once I became a doctor, it seemed like a violation, as if the rules of the game were being broken. I don't know what game I thought we were playing, but it wasn't what I was seeing. Dying and death ultimately confront every new doctor or nurse or other clinician. I think the first times that it happens, I saw people cry. I saw some people shut down. Some seemed to hardly notice. When I saw my first deaths, I was too guarded to weep. I had, however, recurring nightmares in which I'd find my patients' corpses in my house, sometimes even in my bed. I felt as if I'd failed. But death, of course, is not a failure. Death is normal. Death may be the enemy, but it's also the natural order of things. And while I knew those truths abstractly, I didn't really know them concretely, that they could be truths not just for everyone, but also for this person right in front of me, this person I was responsible for. I don't think you have to spend much time with the elderly or those with terminal illness to see how often medicine fails the people that we are purporting to help. The waning days of our lives end up given over to treatments that can addle our brains, will sap our bodies for a sliver's chance of benefit. And then we spend our days, our final days, sometimes months, sometimes years, in institutions, in nursing homes, in ICUs, where regimented anonymous routines cut us off from all the things that actually matter to us in life, from all the things we're trying to live for. As recently as 1950, most deaths occurred in the home. By the late 1990s, it was 17% of us who would die in the home, the rest of us in institutions of one kind or another. And lacking a coherent view of how people might live successfully to the very end, while still being able to take advantage of all the technological capability that medicine has left us with our fates to be controlled by medicine and strangers. But not all of us have let that be our fate. And that was where I got a chance to dig in. I searched out people. I interviewed more than 200 patients and family members about their experiences of aging and of dealing with serious illness. I followed scores of nursing home workers, home health aides, geriatricians, palliative care specialists, pioneers, contrarians, and I was interested in those who'd found pathways that seemed to be more effective. And one of the interesting things was that as I coped with these puzzles where I'd have a patient in front of me and we'd seem to only have two choices. Do we just keep going? Do we take any chance at a sliver of benefit? Or do we just give up? And neither one felt like the right option. And what I found were people who did not give up, but also did not end up making unreal choices. One of the things I found was that it took at least two kinds of courage that they had. The first was the courage to confront the reality of mortality. That was the idea of courage as an ideal of seeking the truth of what is to be feared and what is to be hoped when one is frail or seriously ill. And as if just that courage were difficult enough, even more daunting was a second kind of courage I saw people have, and that was the courage to act on the truth that they found. So a few years ago, I got a late night page. It was from a woman named Jewel Douglas, who was a 72-year-old woman who was a patient of mine. She was receiving chemotherapy for a metastatic ovarian cancer, and she was, when I got that page, let me know she was back in the hospital. She was unable to hold food down. For a week, her symptoms had mounted. It started with some bloating, and then became waves of crampy pain, and then it became nausea and vomiting. Her oncologist sent her to the hospital, and their scan showed that despite the chemotherapy and the treatment, her ovarian cancer had grown and spread and then partially blocked up her intestine. Her abdomen had also filled up with fluid. The deposits of tumor had stuffed up the lymphatic system in her body, which serves as a kind of storm drain for the lubricating fluids that the body's internal linings secrete. When the system gets blocked up, the fluid has nowhere to go, and then the belly fills up like a rubber ball until you feel like you're going to burst. But when I walked into Jewel Douglas's hospital room, I'd never have known that she was so sick if I hadn't seen the scans. "Well, look who's here," she said to me. It was like she'd just arrived, like I'd just arrived at a cocktail party. "How are you, doctor?" I said, "I think I'm supposed to ask you that." And she smiled brightly, and she made, she'd started introductions. She went around the room. "That's my husband, Arthur, whom you know, and here's my son, Brett." And she got me grinning about this situation. Here it was 11 o'clock at night. She couldn't hold down an ounce of water, and she still had her lipstick on, her silver hair brushed straight, and she was insisting on making introductions. Now, our oncologist and I had a menu of options to offer to her. There were a range of alternative chemotherapies which could be tried to try to shrink the tumor burden. I had some surgical options too. I wouldn't be able to remove the intestinal blockage, but I might be able to bypass it, I told her. I could give her an ileostomy, which involves disconnecting the bowel above the blockage and bringing it through the skin to empty into a bag. I could also put in a couple of drainage catheters, permanent spigots that could be opened to release the fluids from her blocked up drainage ducts or her intestines if necessary. The surgery risked serious complications, wound breakdown, leakage of bowel contents into the abdomen, infection, but it was the only way she might regain her ability to eat. I also told her we did not have to do either chemo or surgery. We could provide medications to control her pain and her nausea and arrange for hospice care at home. Now, this is the moment when I would have normally reviewed the pros and cons of all of those options. But I think we're only gradually learning in the medical profession that that's not what we need to do. The options were already overwhelming her. They all sounded terrifying. So I stepped back and asked a few questions I learned from some of those hospice workers and palliative care physicians who I met, hoping to better help both of us know what to do. So I asked her, what were her biggest fears and concerns? What goals were most important to her? What trade-offs was she willing to make and not willing to make? Not everyone is very comfortable answering those kinds of questions, but she did. She said she wanted to be without pain, nausea, or vomiting. She wanted to eat. Most of all, she wanted to be back on her feet. Her biggest fear was that she wouldn't be able to return home and be with the people she loved. I asked what sacrifices she'd be willing to endure now for the possibility of more time later. And she said, not a lot. Uppermost in her mind was a wedding that weekend that she was desperate not to miss. Arthur's brother is marrying my best friend, she said. She'd set them up on their first date. The wedding was just 2 days away. She was supposed to be the bridesmaid, and she said she would be willing to do anything to try to make it. And suddenly, with just those few simple questions, I had some guidance about her priorities, what our goals might be. So we made a plan to see if we could meet them. We used a long needle to tap a liter of fluid out of her abdomen. We gave her medication to control her nausea, and we discharged her with instructions to drink nothing thicker than apple juice and then to come back and see me right after the wedding. She didn't make it. She came home. She came back to the hospital that night. Just the car ride with the swaying and the bumps set her sick again. And things only got worse when she was at home. So she arrived back and we agreed that, well, surgery was the best course now. And we scheduled it for the next day. I'd have to focus on restoring her ability to eat and putting the drainage tubes in. And afterwards she could decide if she wanted more chemotherapy or to go on to hospice. She was as clear as anyone I'd seen about her goals, and yet still she was in doubt. She'd had the courage to look at the facts in the face, but then the fear of whether she would take this step. The next morning she canceled the operation, and she said, "I'm afraid." She tossed all night imagining the pain, the tubes, the horrors of the possible complications that we talked about. She said, "I don't want to take risky chances." Her difficulty wasn't the lack of courage to act in the face of the risks, it was sorting out how to think about them. Her greatest fear was of suffering, she said. Couldn't the operation make that worse rather than better? And I said it could. The surgery offered her the possibility of being able to eat again, and a very good likelihood of controlling her nausea, but also had substantial risk of making her worse in certain ways. I said, a 75% chance that the surgery would make her future better, at least for a little while, and a 25% chance it would make that future worse. So now what do you decide? The brain gives us two ways to evaluate experiences like suffering. How we apprehend those kinds of experiences in the moment and how we look at them afterward. We have really two different selves described by Daniel Kahneman, the Nobel Prize-winning researcher. There's the self who is called the experiencing self, who endures every moment equally. And then there is the remembering self, who gives almost all the weight to judgment afterward about 2 points in time: the worst moment of what had happened and the last moment of what had happened. So we look very differently as a remembering self about the past versus the experiencing self in the moment. And they come to radically different opinions about the same experience. So which one should you listen to? That was at bottom her torment. Should she heed her remembering self, or in this case the anticipating self, which is focused on the worst moment she might endure? Or should she listen to her experiencing self, which would likely endure a lower average amount of suffering in the days to come if she underwent surgery, rather than just go home, that she might even get to eat again? So the difficulty is that in the end, people don't view their life as merely the average of its moments, which is, after all, mostly a bunch of nothing plus some sleep. Life is meaningful because it's a story. And the story's arc is determined by the moments when something happens. So unlike your experiencing self, which is absorbed in the moment, your remembering self is attempting to recognize not only the peaks of joy and the valleys of misery, but also how the story works out as a whole. This is why, if you're watching a football game this weekend, you would let a few flubbed moments at the end of the game ruin 3 hours of bliss. Because a football game is a story, and in the story, endings matter. So Jewel Douglas didn't know if she was willing to face the suffering that the surgery might inflict, and feared being left worse off, having an ending that didn't work. I don't want to take risky chances, she said. She didn't want to take a high-stakes gamble on how that story was going to end. And suddenly I realized she was telling me everything that I needed to know. We should go to surgery, I told her. but with her directions that she just spelled out, to do what I could to enable her to return home to her family while not taking risky chances. I'd put in a small laparoscope, I'd look around, and I'd attempt to unblock her intestine only if I saw that I could do it fairly easily. If it looked risky, I'd just put tubes in to drain her backed up pipes. I'd aim for what might sound like a contradiction in terms, a palliative operation. An operation whose overriding priority was to only do what was likely to make her feel immediately better. So she remained quiet, thinking about it, unsure. Her daughter took her hand and said, "We should do this, Mom." And then she said, "Okay, but no risky chances." So we went to the operating room, and when she was asleep, made a half-inch incision above her belly button, and I slipped a gloved finger inside to feel for the space to put the scope in, and it was just rock hard, tumor everywhere. I wasn't even going to be able to put in a camera. So then I extended the incision to make room to look around and see what I could do. And there were too many deposits of adherent tumor stuck to the intestine to let me do anything to bypass the blockage, do anything that might let her eat again. If I kept going, I would risk creating holes that would make a leakage that would just be a calamity. And so we stopped trying to make it possible for her to eat again. Instead, I shifted focus and put in 2 long plastic drainage tubes, one directly into her stomach to empty the contents backing up there, the other outside to drain all that fluid backing up from the storm drains of her gut. And then we closed up and we were done. I told her family in the family waiting area that we had not been able to help her eat again, and when Douglas woke up, I told her too. Her daughter wept. Her husband thanked us for trying. Douglas tried to put a brave face on it. "I was never obsessed with food anyway," she said. The tubes relieved her nausea and pain greatly. 90%, she said. The nurses taught her how to open the gastric tube into a bag when she felt sick, and the abdominal tube when her belly felt too tight. We told her she could drink whatever she wanted and even eat some soft food for the taste. And then 3 days after surgery, she went home with hospice care to look after her. Before she left, she asked her oncologist how long she thought she had. Jewel said she filled up with tears. It was kind of my answer. A few days later, she and her family allowed me to stop by her home after work one day. She answered the door wearing a robe because of the tubes for which she apologized. We sat in her living room and I asked her how she was doing. And she said, "I'm doing okay. But I think I have a measure that I'm," as she put it, slipping. She'd been seeing old friends and relatives all day, and that she loved. She was taking just Tylenol for pain. Narcotics made her drowsy and weak, and it interfered with her seeing people, and that's what she wanted to do above all. She said she didn't like the contraption sticking out of her, but the first time she just opened a tube that could take away her nausea, she said, "I looked at the tube and I said, 'Thank you for being there.'" Mostly we talked about the good memories. She was at peace with God. She said, "I left feeling that at least this once we'd done it right." Douglas's story was not ending the way she ever envisioned, but it was nonetheless ending with her being able to make choices that meant the most to her. 2 weeks later, her daughter, Susan, sent me a note. "Mom died on Friday morning. She drifted quietly to sleep and took her last breath. It was very peaceful. My dad was alone by her side with the rest of us in the living room. This was such a perfect ending and in keeping with the relationship that they had." I'm leery of suggesting that endings are controllable. No one ever really has control. Physics and biology and the accident ultimately have their way in our lives. But Jewel Douglas taught me we're not helpless either. And courage is the strength to recognize both of those realities. We have room to act and shape our stories, although as we get older, we do so within narrower and narrower confines. And that makes a few conclusions clear. Our most cruel failure in how we treat the sick and the aged is the failure to recognize that they have priorities besides merely being safe and living longer. That the chance to shape one's story is essential to sustaining meaning in life. And that we have the opportunity to refashion our institutions, culture, and most importantly, our conversations to transform the possibilities for the last chapters of all our lives. Thank you. Happy to take some questions. I suppose we're going to pass a microphone around, so did I see?
I'm going to bring
sure,
you
over there.
Hi, my name's Rhodes Hambrick, and I'm a medical student here at NYU. Thank you so much, first of all, for sharing this with us. I'm interested to hear your opinion on how best, as a future clinician, to explain the concept of brain death, because I feel like it's something that's misunderstood, and oftentimes, even recently in the news, you see people who are campaigning to be left on really intense life support measures, despite the fact that they've passed the point of neurological resuscitation. Just how best to have those conversations, how best to frame those conversations, given that mortality is the subject of this book.
It's a very difficult conversation when the person in question can't answer them, right? And the difficulty is that the discussion hadn't been had in advance. A lot of those same questions I asked Jewel Douglas, which are the ones that when you see what people who are really effective in being able to have conversations with patients and families have, are really to ask some basic ideas. And they're questions around what you consider a life worth living. What is a life worth saving you for? So understanding what are the fears and worries you have as your health worsens? What are the goals you might have for your life? I tell the story of one of my colleagues. And another question is, what outcomes would not be acceptable to you? One of my colleagues has a father who had was becoming quadriplegic from a kind of cyst that bled in his spinal cord. And when she talked to him about what was most important in his life, he said, well, if I can still eat chocolate ice cream and watch football on television, that's going to be good enough for me. I tell the story of my dad, who ended up with a astrocytoma, a cancer in his brainstem and spinal cord. And I told him that story, and he said, that is not good enough for me. He was a very social guy, a surgeon, control freak, and wanted to be able to interact with people and be who he was, which also was that he wanted some way that he could still make a contribution in the world. Now, when my wife and I have this conversation, I think I'm more like my dad that way. I can, as long as I can interact with people and be who I am, that's valuable to me. My wife says, if I look happy, then that's okay. Like, just keep me going. If I just look happy, that is good enough. Now, the concept of brain death is something that you'd just be bringing across as a bunch of facts. But the real question is, what does this person think a life worth living is about? And my wife might have said, well, do I look happy? Whereas I would have said, that is not who I am. Now, whether she'll listen to me when I say pull that plug when that happens is another question. I think also what complicates it is that we know that as we grow and change, our answers change to these questions. And so we have to repeat them as we face the travails in our life. What we say at my age versus what I will say 30 years from now could change a lot. And so I think where we get a mistake is in the idea that it's all about being able to describe the scientific state of the brain that's the missing component. It's really the most effective folks have a conversation where they do less than 50% of the talking. And it's asking the questions of the family and the patient to say, what is a life that is worth living to them? And it's very painful for the family when none of that conversation's happened, because you have really no clue about what this person might have said.
You mentioned asking the questions, but you also mentioned institutional change. And what is it going to take to change the way we think, the way the medical profession works? And from that, I draw the parallel of your book on the Checklist Manifesto. I had a procedure recently, and for the first time, there was a checklist, which, as a private pilot, makes a lot of sense. But how did that happen, and how can that apply to what we're talking about today?
I do think there's a paradigm shift, and in many ways, it's. I wrote this book because I didn't feel like I knew what to do. I'm a cancer surgeon, and yet I felt after 10 years of taking care of patients, seeing many of them come to their end, that I was not effective in sorting through these decisions. I would invariably tell people this kind of, well, on the one hand, we could try to do something, and there's only a small chance that it'll work, or we could give up and there's zero chance it's going to work, right? So then you'd always end up going down that road. And the real shift has been because I didn't feel like I had the words, and seeing and understanding what the words were that helped you say, well, what really matters in your life? What are the priorities that you have that matter? If time is short, what are the goals you might have? What are the outcomes you wouldn't accept? Allows some direction in planning. There have been a series of studies showing that when people have those conversations, for example, a randomized study at Mass General Hospital with stage 4 lung cancer patients, they lived on average 11 months. Half of them got standard oncology care. The other half got standard oncology care, plus a palliative physician who spoke to them early on about what their goals might be in the worst case scenario. And the ones who had those conversations in advance ended up stopping their chemotherapy sooner, went on to hospice earlier, had less suffering at the end of life, and they lived 25% longer, which just meant we were making bad decisions all along. Now the solution, you might say then, is, well, let's scale. Everybody has a palliative care physician. We don't have remotely enough physicians. And the idea that you outsource this capability of having priorities that matter, that you can voice them, I think the solution is that we have to be able to make it so this is what all clinicians know how to do. We don't teach it in medical school. We don't teach it in residency. There are a few basic things that we can actually end up trying. Not only teach it at that level, but even turn the people who are really good at these kinds of conversations, geriatricians, palliative care doctors, and others, into people that our health systems have evaluate what's the quality of the conversations that their colleagues are having, and then coach them and help improve their outcomes. I don't write about it in the book, but we're actually running a trial at the Dana-Farber Cancer Institute, and we were able to get 80% of the clinicians to sign up for the trial. Half of them are getting the training, half of them are not. We're going to have the first early results next year. And just the fact that we've actually gotten them in and gotten the training done has been absolutely fascinating. It's been, it's feasible. It's possible to do these things.
Hi, I'm JP. I think a lot of people in the room would like to contribute to their careers like you do beyond their day-to-day life. And so I'm curious if you could talk a little bit about brass tacks of what it's been like to become a surgeon, also have a family, start writing at the same time, and maybe any advice that you have for people on, behind the curtain, what's happening? What kind of discussions do you have with your wife or the people that you work with to make these things happen?
Oh, you don't want to be in that room. Because I steal time from people constantly. So I do a lot of writing on the weekends, my Saturday mornings and Sunday mornings. So my wife and kids go off to church, and I don't. This is my religion. I steal time, when there's downtime or a case is canceled and you suddenly have some time on your hands, I steal that. I actually plot it out so that I have 25% of my schedule that is not scheduled with meetings or with this and that, so that I can do work. And it's not just writing, it's some of the research we do and other things, but it leaves some brain space for some of that to happen. I think also fundamental part of it is I kind of gave up a long time ago on the idea that there was balance in my life. If you really want to make a difference or try really hard things, they suck up your life. And that was okay with me. So I loved diving in as a surgeon, but I felt like I would burn out if I couldn't pull back and figure out what was meaningful and worthwhile about it. Writing ended up being my way of being able to connect the dots. I never quite was sure how it all came together, and weirdly it's through research that I get things that bother me in the day-to-day course of events. It might be how the health system works. It might be what happens with aging patients. It might be, why we itch. And writing was my way to kind of investigate, dig in, get an excuse to do things like call up 200 patients and tell them, hey, can I come talk to you about what it's like to be really old? That you'd never get a chance to do that kind of thing, but because I'm a writer, I can go do that, right? And then you'd get ideas, and then you could, the surgeon in me would come out and say, well, let's do something about it. Let's try it. And that became the research part of what I do. And, I'm a kind of B as a dad. I'm not like an A as a dad or a husband, because I will, right before I got out here, I called my wife and said, how's my daughter's recital going? It's like, the choices aren't always the best ones. But the combination is really gratifying. I love all the pieces that I have and get to put them together. For some people in your work, you have to find a way to pull back out of it. And it might be the time you spend with your family. It might be music. It might be, the book you read. It might be the research you do. It might be any number of things. And for me, it's been being able to dive in and try to learn to write.
Hi, thank you. Can you hear me?
Yes.
I don't need to stand up, do I?
No.
Okay, great. I'm going to try to get through this without crying.
Okay.
But just that caveat. Part of the reason I'm here is because yesterday I visited my grandmother, who's 94 and physically quite healthy and mentally declining really fast. And it's obviously very hard to witness. She's someone who was always incredibly independent, traveled the world, lived a very full life after my grandfather died when I was just 8. And several times now she has basically said to me when I was there that she wants to just go to sleep and not wake up. But it's likely she won't do that for a very long time because she's quite healthy. And I'm just wondering how you frame what you're talking about today for people who are in that kind of a situation and for their family members who, quite honestly don't know what to do.
I can feel what you're going through, and I can tell you that this is what hundreds of thousands of people are going through. When we build the places that we have people go to when they can't take care of themselves, we've invested them with what are really medical values. So she's safe and she's healthy. But I write about a person named Bill Thomas in upstate New York who came on to a nursing home and saw a lot of miserable people. And what he described it as was the 3 plagues of boredom, loneliness, and helplessness. And what he wanted to do was find a cure for the 3 plagues. And what he did was he ended up fighting to bring pets into these places, to make it possible for everybody in the nursing home he was working at to actually own their own pets. They could pick. You want a dog? You want a cat? You want a pair of parakeets? He brought 100 parakeets and they thought he was crazy. He had to fight the regulations. Birds were not allowed in nursing homes. They're not safe. Right? The idea of safety trumps the idea of meaning. But in fact, we care about meaning in our lives. And he started seeing people come alive out of the opportunity that even you could be quite confused, but have the opportunity to care about something else bigger than yourself, that it could give you purpose. And he saw people come out of their shells. He saw the amount of medication to deal with anxiety and psychosis go down. He saw mortality improve. And the secret wasn't the pets. It was the idea that people live for something larger than themselves. At another place I went, run by this pioneering woman named Jackie Carson in northern Mass, and she had turned her senior low-income housing apartment building she ran into a place where they focused on what is it that folks have as a life worth living. And I write briefly about a woman named Ruthie Barrett who had Alzheimer's disease, and she was missing 40 years of her life. She thought she was 50 years old. I asked her, to describe her husband, and she said that he was never a guy who liked a day of work in his life. She did all the work in their life, but had missed the last 30 years in many ways. But for her most joyful moments were the time she got to spend with other people and eat food and go out. And so they worked to make it possible every Friday night for her and a group of people to go out to dinner at the place that she liked. She liked TGI Fridays. And she would go there and she'd order a margarita and be happy as a clam. A margarita, verboten in most nursing homes you'll ever go to, especially with a diabetic Alzheimer's patient. And they're like, screw it. Let her have this moment of joy. And the idea that you can have purpose, it feels to me that, even though she's 94, even though she's needs help being cared for, this is the part that's missing. And I write, in fact, half of this book is not about the end of life. Once you start realizing that there are priorities in people's lives besides just survival, you realize that works its way all the way back to how we start dealing and managing with the realities of aging, the realities of needing help at various points in our lives in order to live day to day. And that it can be possible to make it so there is meaning behind that. I'm hoping that some of those ideas might be ones that, when people see it, are ones that help change not only the conversations we have, but the nature of the way we run these institutions. And might even be helpful in your ability to push for a little bit more. The life of many folks like her are passive games, watching television, sitting in a chair, and having no connection to things that are meaningful. I think that can change.
What are your thoughts on things like the Death with Dignity Act?
So she was asking about the Death with Dignity Act. On one level, I feel like the chance to that we would be heartless to not admit that there are people in unbearable suffering for whom we have to offer some freedom and choice about their way out of the matter. We will take people off ventilators when they're in that kind of severe suffering, and there will be some people for whom a prescription that they can take themselves might be the acceptable way to go. And yet at the same time, I'm really bothered by the emphasis we put on that as the kind of next mission in this line of work. Part of it is the idea that what people want is a good death, and the goal to me is not a good death. The goal to me is a good life, as good a life as possible all the way to the very end. Assisting people to live is much harder than assisting people to die. And I'm troubled by the example in the Netherlands where, on the one hand, it's quite accepted in society. Netherlands was the earliest to do death with dignity, as it's called, give people the chance to choose to, assisted suicide. And the Netherlands was one of the last countries in Europe to actually have a hospice movement and palliative care become part of care. So if you are suffering and you have no pathway other than that, that's what we do. right? If we have no pathway for her 94-year-old grandmother, she might well say, well, then, of course, that's what I'll choose. But for huge numbers of people, we are able to open alternative pathways by just asking these questions about what their priorities might be and making it possible to relieve them. I wrote in the New York Times just yesterday, there was an excerpt about my daughter's piano teacher who had metastatic cancer, 62 years old, 2 weeks in the hospital as she was nearing the end of life, in terrible pain, incontinent, and miserable. She called wanting to try to have a discussion about whether she should try to go for experimental therapy or do what they were telling her, which was just go on to hospice, and she felt like the choices were, do we fight or we just give up? And neither felt like the right option. And when we had this discussion about what her priorities were, what mattered to her the most, we zeroed in on the idea that she had not even had one single good day. And so she accepted hospice, and the goal was, let's make it possible to have one good day. And they were able to get the pain medication high enough that she actually could relieve her pain and then elevated her sights. She was my daughter's piano teacher, and she said, how about I could teach kids again? And in her last 6 weeks on hospice, she began teaching her students again. My daughter went back to lessons. They would titrate the medication so that she would be alert enough to teach, but not in pain, so that she could focus. And they got her through. My daughter had 4 weeks of lessons and then had her final recital. And at that recital, Peg got to say to her what her last wisdoms were, gave her a book of music, and made sure she understood that music was something special and that she was special enough to keep going. That, I think, is now lying on that bed at the hospital, if she'd been given the choice of death with dignity, many people would have chosen that way, not knowing that possibility was open to her. So it's a complicated answer that I have about it. If I had to vote for it, I would vote for it. But I fear much more not acting to assist people with how we can make a life worth living.
We have time for one more question today.
Hi, yeah. So I study bioethics, so I'm all for reforming sort of medical school and getting more of this ability for physicians to have these conversations with their patients. What I'm sort of wondering about is, on the opposite side, how do we get people to start having that conversation about death earlier, think about dying? I mean, it sounds kind of that sort of, we got advanced directives, but they don't really help. This sort of these narrative questions that you're saying people need to start to consider, how should my life end, or what means good living, all that, don't come up in an advanced directive form at all. So what do? Do we revise advanced directives? Can this only really happen in the hospital, or is there some other way to start these conversations?
I think it is very much a family conversation that's perfectly possible. And I think if we conceive it as, well, let's talk to Grandpa about death. That doesn't work so well. But let's talk to them about what do they love in their life, and what are the outcomes that would be unacceptable as they face their future, and what are the things that they still have that they look forward to, or at least are worried about, that we might be able to relieve along the way. As family members, the thing we were coping with my father was an oncologist who did not have a clue about this. They would give us the menu of, here are all the chemotherapy options. And here my dad was quadriplegic, and she would say, yeah, you might even be playing tennis by the end of the summer. I was like, what the hell are you talking about? This is so far from reality. But my father and I had these conversations where, we were able to make clear what his priorities were. And for him, we pushed her. We said, for him, being able to have days without suffering, and suffering meant relieving pain, being able to be awake and alert, and being able to be well enough to participate with the family life and social life of just being a human being. Like, could he have a social life again? When we walked through all the options, really pushing, that was where we had we could push the doctor to recognize that, none of these options were going to preserve the things he had left. They would sacrifice them. They would take it away. And that allowed us to push the direction where we needed it to go, even when the doctor wasn't ready for it. And I think families can do that. It is much easier to have those conversations before the crisis comes. It's very hard in the middle of a crisis. Thank you.
Give it up for Atul.